Charles Peterson was standing in the exquisitely decorated living room of his mother's house. It was another Monday morning, which meant he should have been at his own home, but his mother wouldn't have it. After the previous night's dinner, he glanced at himself in the mirror again. His chiseled face seemed to be carved from the same stone as the massive houses that surrounded him. "Charles, dear, you should wear the navy blue suit for today's meeting. It makes you look more mature instead of this one," said his mother, Helen Peterson, as she entered his room with a cup of coffee in her hands. Charles closed his eyes, tilting his face upward. "Mother, I feel that. Don't forget to tie your tie properly. I can't allow you to look like some kind of bohemian," she interrupted him. He rolled his eyes in exasperation as he adjusted his tie for the 100th time that morning. Noticing his mother's gaze still on him, he headed to the room on the right, where his suits were neatly arranged. Grabbing one of the suits from the hanger, he quickly put it on, not wanting to be late. As he exited the room, she was waiting by the door. "Don't forget the speech I prepared for you. Once you tell everyone, they'll be convinced. I'll be there before the meeting starts." "But, Mother, shouldn't it be something I wrote myself? If I tell them how I truly feel about taking the company forward, they'd be happy to be a part of it." Helen Peterson sipped her coffee slowly, and her face immediately tensed. The coffee was cooling down just like her smile. "What do I tell you about these things? Just trust me, Charles, and do as I say." She placed her free hand on his shoulder. Charles knew exactly what she was saying. She wanted him to follow her will once again, as always. Her words sounded like a threat. "All right, Mother, I need to organize the packages for the orphanage first, and then I'll head to work." He kissed her cheek before leaving the room and the house. He stepped out of the grand mansion into the fresh morning air. His driver, James, was already waiting by the car. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning, James. Take me to the orphanage, please." Charles nodded, settling into the back seat as they drove through the city. He gazed out the window, his mind drifting to the meeting ahead. His mother had prepared a rather lengthy speech, and he wasn't exactly looking forward to it, but he knew all too well that he couldn't disobey her. The 20-minute drive ended with them arriving at the orphanage, a combination of two large apartments surrounded by a small garden. A woman was already waiting outside with a smile on her face. He stepped out of the car and was immediately greeted by her warm smile. "Good morning, Sister Margaret." "Oh, Charles, dear. Thank you for coming. We are so grateful for your family's support," she said, quickly shaking his hands. Charles smiled and followed her inside, where he was greeted by the buzz of children. He spent the next hour helping to organize the food and clothing packages he had sent earlier that day, chatting with the children and listening to their stories. "Sir, your mother." James approached Charles, who was reading a book to the children, and handed him the phone. Charles quickly stood up, realizing that if he didn't leave now, he would be late for the meeting he was supposed to attend. As he prepared to leave, Sister Margaret approached him with a small box. "For your mother, Charles. A little gift from the children." He took the box, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, sister. I'll deliver it to her." With one last wave to everyone, he hurried back to the car, and James quickly pulled away from the orphanage, knowing they had to beat the clock. When Charles arrived at the office, he took a deep breath and headed to the conference room where the meeting was being held. His secretary was already waiting with the prepared speech in hand. He handled the papers in his hand, trying to quickly scan through the pages. "Good morning, everyone," he began, trying to sound confident as he entered the conference room. "I'm here today to talk about Verde technology. Our solar panels harness the sun's energy and reduce carbon emissions by 50%. He paused, trying to remember the exact figure. He glanced at his notes, but his eyes skimmed the page without focus. "Oh, yes. And our wind turbines generate electricity at a rate of 2.5 megawatts. The clients exchanged glances, seemingly unimpressed. One raised an eyebrow, and another jotted something down on his pad. Charles tried to recover, but his words only became more muddled. "And our energy storage systems use advanced battery technology to optimize energy efficiency and reduce waste." He stopped, struggling to recall the key points he wanted to make. The clients exchanged glances, their expressions growing increasingly skeptical. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to gather himself. The room fell silent, and Charles felt the eyes of the executives and more importantly, his mother on him. He knew he was struggling, but he couldn't find his footing. "Let me start over," he said, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry, I'll get straight to the point." He took a deep breath, avoiding his mother's eyes. He had a bad feeling from the beginning about using something written by his mother, and despite having practiced it all, he still didn't feel comfortable. "Look, I know we're not just selling solar panels and wind turbines. We're selling a chance to make a difference, a chance to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and create a more sustainable future. At Verde Technology, we believe our responsibility goes beyond just providing sustainable energy solutions. We're committed to making a positive impact in the communities we serve." Pointing to the screen behind him, he showed a content table. The Green Schools program provided educational resources and workshops to teach children about renewable energy and sustainability. We've also partnered with local organizations to develop community gardens and green spaces, providing access to fresh produce and promoting environmental responsibility, he added. "And we're committed to transparency and accountability in everything we do. We publish annual sustainability reports detailing our progress and impact. We also have an independent advisory board that ensures our practices are aligned with our values and mission." Charles paused, scanning the room to make eye contact with the clients. "We believe that business can be a force for good, and we are dedicated to leading by example." The listeners paid attention, their expressions shifting from skepticism to interest. "I believe in what we do," Charles smiled, letting his conviction show. "And I know that together, we can make a real difference." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in applause. The clients smiled, nodding in approval. "Thank you, Charles." One of them finally spoke, looking at his partners in approval. "That was a great presentation. We can see that you're passionate about what your company does." Another executive spoke up. "I have to say, I was skeptical at first, but you really convinced me of your company's values. Can you tell us more about what you do?" Charles smiled, relieved that the presentation had gone well. "Of course, our company, Verde Technology, specializes in sustainable energy solutions. We design and implement renewable energy systems for businesses and homes, helping them reduce their carbon footprint and save on energy costs." One of the executives asked, "That sounds impressive. Can you give us some examples of your work?" "Yes," he nodded. "We've worked with several large companies to install solar panels and wind turbines, reducing their energy costs by up to 50%. We've also helped homeowners transition to renewable energy sources, reducing their reliance on fossil fuels." The executives nodded, taking notes and asking follow-up questions. After a few minutes of Q&A, one of them said, "Thank you, I think we found a partner." Charles excused himself from the meeting room, feeling relieved that the presentation had gone well. As he entered his office, he was closely followed by his mother, who looked less than pleased. "Charles, what was that?" she demanded, closing the door behind her. "You didn't follow the plan?" He looked at his mother, trying to stay calm. "Mother, I know I didn't follow the script, but I felt I needed to speak from the heart." "Speak from the heart?" "This is business, Charles, not a charity event to make you feel good. You need to stick to the plan and make a strong impression." "But, Mother, I think I made a good impression. The clients seem to respond well to my passion." "Passion?" she interrupted him again. "This isn't about passion, Charles. It's about doing business and growing the company. You need to focus on the bottom line, not your feelings." Without a word, he walked past his mother, opening the door. "I need some air." "Charles, what are you doing? You can't just walk out in the middle of the day," his mother began to protest. But he was already determined not to stay another minute with her. As he left the building, James, his driver, was waiting by the car, looking somewhat concerned. "Sir, should I take you somewhere?" he asked. "No, James, I need some time alone. I'll drive myself." "I'll be fine, James." Despite his assurance, he saw that James wasn't convinced, but there was nothing he could do. Charles got into the car and pulled out of the building, wanting to be away from it all. He drove aimlessly, trying to clear his mind, until he found himself in a quiet, seemingly upscale neighborhood. He parked the car in a safe spot and got out, wandering the streets, trying to process his emotions. Charles's steps led him to a small restaurant hidden between skyscrapers. The exterior was unremarkable, but something about it drew him inside. He pushed the door open, and a bell above it chimed, breaking the silence. As he entered, his eyes slowly adjusted to the lighting, and he spotted a young woman wiping down tables with a white cloth. Her dark hair was tied back in a ponytail, and a warm smile appeared on her lips when she looked up and met his gaze. For a moment, they just stared at each other. "Hi." She dropped the white cloth on the table, breaking the spell. "Welcome to, well, we don't have a name yet." "Actually," she laughed, and Charles's heart skipped a beat. "But we're getting there. We're not open yet, but you should come back in a week for our grand opening." As he prepared to leave, Charles caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window, a young man who felt like he wanted more. He took a deep breath, savoring the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the warmth of the restaurant, feeling for the first time in a long time that he was exactly where he needed to be. "But if you don't mind, can I get you something to drink?" she asked. "We're still experimenting with our menu, but I can whip up something special." Charles turned, nodding eagerly as he sat at the counter, still watching her. "Try this." She handed him a glass filled with a velvety liquid a short time later. "It's one of our signature drinks. We call it Midnight Sky." As he took a sip, he wondered why she seemed like an enigma. His eyes widened in surprise as he took another sip. The flavors danced on his tongue, and he could only describe it as something between sweet and savory. "This is really amazing," he smiled at her, finishing the remaining contents of the glass. The young woman's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I'm glad you like it. I'm sorry, I know this isn't the right place to ask, but what brought you here?" The place clearly looks deserted, especially from the outside. Charles hesitated, unsure of what exactly to say to someone he had just met. "It's been a hard day for me. I know the day isn't over yet, but it is what it is. My mother is constantly on my back." "Well, aren't they all?" She laughed, placing her hands on the counter. "What exactly did she do this time?" "My mother. She can't leave me alone. She wants to be involved in everything I'm doing and also does her best to ensure her decision is my final decision." "Even when you're against it?" He sighed, nodding slowly. "Even when I don't want to. And all I want is for her to see that I'm an adult." Of course, she sees that, but she doesn't want to admit it yet. Maybe she simply doesn't want to accept that you won't be her little boy anymore. I guess things like that can be super scary sometimes. Charles watched as her forehead glistened with beads of sweat due to work, but it didn't diminish her beauty. "I didn't catch your name earlier." "I'm Charles." She immediately smiled, stepping away from the counter. "I'm Sophia." He glanced at his Swiss watch, suddenly shocked at how much time had passed. "How did I spend so much time here? Is it your beauty that kept me, or the drink?" Sophia gave him a look, making him laugh. "Don't flatter me, Charles. It's probably the drink." Charles hesitated, not wanting the moment to end. "Can I see you again?" Sophia raised an eyebrow, giving him a funny look. "I don't know. I'm pretty busy with the restaurant. My birthday is coming up, and I'd love for you to be there. It would mean a lot to me." She laughed with a tone of amusement in her voice. "I don't know, I might be busy for a while. We're still getting everything in order here." Charles nodded, understanding. "I get it. But in any case, we should exchange contacts. I'd like to stay in touch." "Okay, sure. But no promises." "Okay, no promises, I swear. I just want to make sure I can find you again." He smiled, feeling triumphant. "I guess we'll see each other again. Take care." He quickly left the restaurant. It took a few weeks before Charles even thought about mentioning Sophia to his mother before his birthday. "Charles, what are you thinking? A Peterson does not associate with service industry workers." She gave him a look, dropping the spoon. Charles shifted uncomfortably, knowing he had displeased his mother. "Mother, I just met her and—" "It doesn't matter. You need to maintain a certain social level, Charles," she huffed, shaking her head. "You don't expect me to accept you dating a waitress, do you? What would that say about the company?" He sighed dramatically as the food suddenly tasted bland in his mouth. "Please, Mother, can you give her a chance? She's nothing like what you think." Helen looked at her dear son, the only son she had, and smiled. "I arranged a dinner for this weekend, and it was supposed to be just the two of us. Now that you've told me that, what's her name again?" she asked. "Sophia." "Thank you, Mother. She'll be here." He got up, excited that his mother had changed her mind. "I'm off now. I have a trip tomorrow." He had barely left his mother's mansion when he texted Sophia about the dinner. He wanted to call her, but she had scolded him several times when he texted while she was working. It wasn't what she had planned for that weekend, but it didn't hurt to go. The weekend arrived quickly, and Sophia arrived at the property and was impressed by the grandeur of the gate entrance. When she stepped out of the taxi, she was taken aback by the opulent decor. Shock and embarrassment flooded her as she looked at her clothes. When she entered, she was surprised by the opulent decoration and well-dressed staff. "Charles, why didn't you tell me?" she whispered to Charles, who was waiting outside for her. "I feel so out of place." Charles seemed surprised by her reaction. "I'm sorry, Sophia. You look beautiful anyway. Don't flatter me. I'm warning you for the last time." She playfully tapped him on the arm. "You never told me you lived in another world." "That's not an exaggerated compliment now." He leaned closer to her, smiling. "I'm glad I didn't tell you. Now you wouldn't have accepted giving me your number." Sophia was about to retort when she heard someone clap. Looking in the direction of the sound, she saw a stunning woman dressed in a long black dress. "I would have left you two outside, but dinner is about to start, dears. Sophia, come along." Sophia exchanged a glance with Charles, who smiled and directed her toward his mother. "That's my mother, Helen Peterson." Sophia and Helen walked into the mansion together, and Sophia tried not to let her jaw drop in admiration of how beautiful everything was. When they reached the dining room, which, in Sophia's opinion, was larger than the entire restaurant, all the maids were lined up at the edges of the room. Charles pulled out a chair for her, making her smile as she sat. He sat beside her, across from his mother, who couldn't stop staring at them. Just as they were about to start eating, Charles's phone rang, and he answered it. "I'm sorry, but there's something I need to deal with right now. I'll be back before you know it." He squeezed Sophia's hand gently before leaving the table. "Well, dinner must go on. He'll join us soon, so eat." Helen gestured to Sophia, who started eating. "Tell me, Rosa, what inspired your choice of attire? Interesting." Sophia looked up, smiling. "It's Sophia, Mother. I just thought it was a pretty dress, I guess." Helen smiled sweetly. "Well, it's certainly eye-catching. In your profession, tell me what it's like being a waitress." "It's quite an experience, Mother. I interact with different people every day, and it's fun for me. Sometimes the restaurant has peak hours, which means everyone has to be busy." "You speak as if that's a good thing." Sophia's eyes darted to the side as she thought to herself. "For me, it's better than doing nothing." Speaking of which, Charles's birthday ball will be the event of the season. The guest list is a true selection of society. I dare say it will be a night to remember. We'll have royalty, celebrities, and business magnates all in attendance. It will be a night of glamour and sophistication like you've never experienced, I'm sure. Helen paused, taking a sip of her wine, savoring the moment and the place. "Oh, it will be dazzling. We've rented out the entire estate, and the decorations will be exquisite. I spared no expense to ensure this will be a night to remember. After all, Charles deserves only the best." Sophia's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the high-profile event. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of hesitation about attending. "Oh, I'm sure it will be," Sophia replied, trying to sound indifferent, despite her growing doubts. As the evening drew to a close, Charles escorted Sophia to the exit, thanking her for coming. "I'm sorry if my mother was a bit much," he whispered, holding her hands. Sophia smiled faintly. "I had a good time. The only thing missing was you. You were absent for most of the dinner." "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." He pulled her into a hug. The next day, Sophia received the dress along with a note from Helen. "Dear Sophia, I thought this dress would be perfect for Charles's birthday ball. Formal events can be so intimidating. I wanted to help. Best wishes, Helen." Sophia touched the hem of the fabric, seeing that it seemed expensive enough. What cheered her more was the kind gesture from her mother-in-law. After the dinner last night, she was slightly convinced that Helen didn't like her, but this showed that it wasn't the case. After settling into her apartment after dinner, she rummaged through her wardrobe, looking for something nice to wear for his birthday. Nothing would make her repeat the mistake she made before of not dressing well, but she didn't need to do that again. She had something unique to wear on the day of the event. She wore the elegant black dress, which was clearly made of luxurious fabric that hugged her curves in the right places. The dress fell just above her knees and had a beautiful neckline that didn't show too much of her chest. She paired the dress with a pair of silver shoes, which added a few inches to her height. The shoes were a gift he sent along with the jewelry when she told him that his mother had sent her a dress. She was glad the shoes were comfortable enough to wear for a few hours. Her look was completed with a simple necklace and a pair of pearl earrings that he bought for her. She kept her hair simple, pulling it back into a low ponytail. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt confident and beautiful. All she needed to do now was step out and get into the car that Charles had sent for her. Sophia arrived at the mansion and was amazed by the decorations. As she approached the door, she was greeted by a team of security guards and event staff who were checking guests' invitations and IDs. Sophia approached them confidently, expecting to be allowed in without any problems. "Good evening, welcome to the event." One of the staff greeted her, looking her up and down. "May I see your invitation, please?" She hesitated, realizing she didn't have an invitation. "I'm a guest of Charles," she said. "He invited me personally." The staff member raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, but I need to see your invitation or confirmation email to let you in." At that moment, a woman with an iPad and a stern expression approached them. "I'm the event coordinator," she introduced herself, raising the iPad to check Sophia's face. "I'm afraid this woman is not on the guest list." The event coordinator turned to Sophia. "I'm sorry, but you're not authorized to enter. You'll have to leave." Sophia stepped away from the entrance and took out her phone. She dialed Charles's number, hoping he would answer and clear up the misunderstanding. But the phone rang and rang with no answer. Sophia tried again, thinking maybe he was busy or didn't hear, but again, there was no answer. She sent a text, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Hi, it's Sophia. I'm outside. They won't let me in. What's going on?" But there was no response. Sophia felt a wave of worry and frustration. Why wasn't Charles answering her calls or texts? Charles's eyes scanned the room, looking for Sophia, who had informed him earlier that she was on her way. But as the minutes passed, he couldn't help but feel a little distracted. If she had arrived, she would have come to say hi to him. Where was she? He assumed she was simply mingling with the guests, but as he moved through the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, he checked his phone and saw the missed calls from Sophia. His heart sank as he quickly dialed her number. "Sophia, where are you?" he asked, alarmed by the number of missed calls. "I'm outside," she responded sadly. "They wouldn't let me in. My name wasn't on the list." Charles's face fell as he realized the mistake. He quickly apologized and headed to the entrance, where he found Sophia looking stunning in the dress his mother had sent. But as he escorted her to the celebration, he couldn't help but notice the curious glances from the other guests. "I'm so sorry. There must have been some kind of mix-up. Please forgive me." Sophia looked at him for a moment before walking toward the champagne table and grabbing a glass for herself. "For a moment I thought about going home and forgetting everything. Thank your stars you got here in time. Thank you for not leaving." He was about to say more when a man approached, informing him that his attention was needed. "I'm sorry, I'll be right back. Enjoy yourself." And with that, he disappeared from view. At first, she tried to enjoy the evening as much as possible, but as the night wore on, she began to notice that something was wrong. People were giving her strange looks, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Excuse me, can you refill my drink?" Someone tapped her on the shoulder. The others seemed to be all occupied. "Please be quick." Sophia turned around, uncertain if the woman was speaking to her. "I'm sorry, but you're mistaken. I'm not a maid." The woman laughed. "Are you serious?" It was then that Sophia realized the dress she was wearing was identical to the uniforms of the house staff. She was being mistaken for a mere servant, and the guests found it hilarious. "I'm not a maid," she repeated, more to herself than to the woman. "I'm a guest." But the woman looked at her with disdain and scoffed. "Sorry, must have mistaken you for someone on the staff." Sophia felt embarrassed and furious at the same time. She knew she needed to find Charles and get out of there as quickly as possible. She looked around, searching for the bathroom. She needed to avoid the mocking looks before they reached her. Fortunately, there was no one in the bathroom at that moment. She stepped into one of the stalls and locked the door, wanting to be alone. She heard the door open and loud voices filled the bathroom. "Can you believe that dress?" One of them turned on the faucet, laughing. Looks like she's trying to be a servant or something. I know, right? The other woman replied, laughing. I saw her trying to mingle with the guests and thought, girl, you're not fooling anyone. Sophia felt a pang of shame and embarrassment. She couldn't believe she had been so blind to Helen's plan. She thought the dress was a kind gesture, but now she realized it was just a cruel trick. She quickly exited the bathroom as soon as the girls left, trying to hold back tears. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed to find Charles and tell him what was happening. But as she approached him, she saw Helen walking toward her, arms open. I hope you know where you belong now, Helen whispered in her ear before Sophia could pull away from the hug. At that moment, she knew she needed to get out of there before things got worse. As Sophia turned to leave, a guest intentionally spilled their drink on her. Look at the helper now. Why don't you go clean that up? Enough! I've had enough. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back tears. She pushed through the crowd that began to form, desperate to escape, but was met with a wall of paparazzi. Who are you? One of them asked, snapping photos. I'm nobody. Just leave me alone. Yet they continued to snap pictures of her. On the other side, Charles was discussing with a potential client about the company when he heard murmurs. Looking in that direction, he spotted Sophia. Excuse me. Charles interrupted the man he was talking to and started walking toward where he last saw her. He saw her moving toward the exit, her clothes stained and paparazzi surrounding her. But by the time he reached the entrance, he saw Sophia getting into a taxi. Sophia, wait, he called out, but the taxi door closed behind her, and the car drove off. He knew he had to make things right. He picked up the phone and called her number, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, but she didn't answer. He knew he needed to talk to her, explain what had happened, and apologize for his mother's mistake. But for now, she was gone, and Charles was left alone outside his own party, feeling helpless and ashamed. Weeks passed, and Charles's distraction at work worsened every day. His mother, Helen, noticed the change in him and confronted him. Charles, what's going on with you? You're not focused on the company at all. We can't lose our edge now when we're on the verge of being taken over. Charles sighed, rubbing his temples. I know, Mother. I'll try to concentrate. But he couldn't get Sophia out of his mind. He tried to immerse himself in work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. He wondered if she was okay, if she had forgiven him. As the days turned into weeks, Charles became increasingly withdrawn. He stopped attending meetings, stopped answering calls, and stopped leaving his office. His mother grew concerned, but Charles couldn't explain what was wrong. He didn't even know himself. One evening, he found himself outside the restaurant where they had met, hoping to see her, but she wasn't there. The next day, he drove to her house, hoping to find her, but she wasn't there either. Feeling desperate, Charles decided to wait for her outside her apartment. He arrived in the morning and sat in the car, watching the entrance. As the hours passed, he began to feel as if he was hallucinating. But then he saw her. His heart skipped a beat. He wondered if he was dreaming, but Sophia saw him and smiled. Charles, what are you doing here? She asked, standing beside the window. He stepped out of the car, feeling like he was in a trance. I don't know. I just needed to see you. Sophia nodded, and Charles followed her inside the apartment, feeling as though he was walking into a dream. The room was decorated with different hand-drawn characters. Sophia led him to the sofa, and they sat together. I missed you, Charles, she began to say immediately. Sophia held his hand. I missed you too. They sat there in silence for a moment, hands intertwined. Then Sophia spoke. I've been thinking a lot about us, Charles, about what happened at the party. Charles nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. I'm sorry, Sophia. I didn't know what happened until later when I heard that someone spilled wine on you. Sophia squeezed his hand. You didn't know, Charles. It was hard for me. I felt so alone and exposed out there. I'm sorry, Sophia. I should have known, and I shouldn't have left you alone. It's been hard waking up every morning and knowing I can't reach you. It's been pure torture. She smiled as she saw the pain in his eyes and understood that it had been hard for him too. Let's have dinner then. What's the best way to celebrate this? Charles let out a cry, embracing her and holding her as if there were no tomorrow. Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you. She held him tight, and he continued to murmur his gratitude. Only some time later, After she had freshened up, did they decide to go out to eat. As they left the apartment, holding hands, Charles noticed a black limousine parked behind his car. His steps slowed, alerting Sophia, who followed his gaze. "What is my mother doing?" he murmured to himself. As Sophia tightened her grip on his hand, her eyes widened when the driver stepped out of the limousine and approached them. "Miss Sophia, your grandfather requests your presence immediately." Charles's eyes narrowed at the man, and he stood in front of Sophia like a barrier. "Who is your grandfather?" "I don't know what's going on, but I have to go." The driver opened the door, waiting for Sophia to step in. "Please, Miss Sophia, your grandfather is waiting." Sophia turned to Charles. "Come with me." Of course, I wouldn't just follow some random person. As they stepped into the limousine, Sophia's anxiety increased. "I've never seen my grandfather send a limousine before. Something must be wrong. I hope he's okay. The last time he wasn't okay, he didn't tell me. I hope everything is all right." Charles held her hand, trying to reassure her. "We'll face this together." The limousine stopped at a large commercial building with the Verde Technology logo plastered on the side. "Wait, why are we here? This is your family's building, right?" Sophia asked as they stepped out of the car. Charles was trying to understand why they were there. As they looked back at the driver, he gestured for them to enter. They quickly entered the building. As they stepped out of the elevator, Charles and Sophia heard someone speaking in one of the offices. Charles knew exactly where it was, and they reached there still confused. A man, with his back to them, was addressing the people in the room about how things would be handled differently. Someone in the room must have alerted the man, because he turned to them, smiling. "Ah, there she is. Your new CEO has arrived," he informed the room, which erupted in applause. "Grandfather." Sophia rushed forward, relieved to see that he was okay, but confused by his statement. Sophia's grandfather laughed. "Yes, my dear. I'm afraid I've kept my true identity and wealth hidden from you, but I've been preparing you for leadership all along." Charles's mind spun as he tried to process the information. Sophia, the woman he loved, was now the CEO of Verde Technology. His mother had told him about some issues related to the next person to lead, but he hadn't been in his normal state. Sophia's grandfather continued. "I had you work at one of my restaurants with my security monitoring your progress. You've shown great potential, my dear, and now it's time for you to take charge." Helen's face turned pale. Her eyes darted from Sophia to Charles. "This can't be," she whispered. George's expression turned stern as he pulled Helen into the office, along with Charles and Sophia. "I know what happened at the birthday party, Helen. Treating my beloved granddaughter that way was unforgivable." Helen's eyes darted from George to Charles and Sophia as she felt the color drain from her face. I can explain." Sophia's grandfather, George, interrupted her. "No, you can't. My initial intention was to sell the company off in pieces, leaving you and your son with crumbs after paying the board. But seeing how much my granddaughter loves Charles and how much he loves her, and since he wasn't part of the scheme, I've changed my mind." Charles's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean, what happened at the party?" Sophia took a deep breath. "Your mother humiliated me, Charles. She made me wear a uniform identical to the staff's, and people thought I was a servant." "Mother, is this true? Are they telling the truth? Why would you do something like that to her?" He approached his mother, who avoided his eyes. That was when he realized, remembering the looks people gave when she arrived at the event. That was why his mother didn't want him to stay away from her after the incident at his birthday. "This will be the last time we have a conversation. I never thought you would go so far as to treat her so badly. You should be better than that." George nodded. "I'm glad to see you're not like your mother, Charles. But now, it's no longer up to me," asked the new CEO. "No, I don't think you should be an employee here," Charles nodded, accepting their decision. He understood how things could end up in the end. "Because I think you'd be better at running things." Charles thought he wasn't hearing right, but the smile on her face made him know he heard right. "Are you serious? Do you mean it?" "Yes, I do. You've proven yourself, Charles. You have the heart and skills to lead this company to greatness." Charles pulled her into a hug, inhaling the perfume around her. "Thank you, my love." In the corner of the room, Helen watched her son and the girl she thought she had resolved embracing. It was more humiliating that her son wasn't even thinking about her. It was as if she didn't exist. She stood there until George invited them to a quick celebratory dinner. Only then did she collapse, falling to her knees as tears streamed down her face. She couldn't help but wish she could turn back time. She had expected many things, but she didn't expect everything to go so wrong for her. She began to realize this when she went to her favorite social club for lunch. The maitre d' looked at her coldly, and the usual table near the window was given to someone else. "I'm afraid we're fully booked today, Mrs. Peterson." Helen was shocked. She had always been treated like royalty at that club. As she left the club, she saw her friends whispering and pointing at her. They quickly looked away, avoiding eye contact. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to brush off the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination. But as the days passed, things only got worse. She was no longer invited to exclusive events, and her calls were no longer returned. Her bank account began to dwindle, and she realized that her money couldn't take her anywhere. Helen's world was crumbling around her. She had lost everything: her reputation, her friends, her status, and all because of her own cruel actions. She tried to reach out to her son, Charles, but he refused to take her calls. He had disowned her, just like everyone else, and that hurt the most. If only she had been more sensible and mature, she wouldn't be in the disaster she found herself in. She never thought that one day, everything she once had would no longer be hers. As Sophia pushed the stroller through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, she couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Her life had taken a dramatic turn since she met Charles, and she was grateful for every moment they spent together. Their daughter, Emerald, was the light of their lives, and she couldn't imagine a future without her. She took a deep breath, soaking in the sweet scent of blooming flowers and freshly baked bread from nearby bakeries. She thought about her life and all the good things that had happened since she met Charles. She remembered how he looked at her on their first date and the picnic they had weeks after he started working as the CEO of the company. She remembered how he held her hand as he taught her how to ride a bicycle. She thought about their wedding day, which came so quickly, but she wasn't nervous. She had what she thought she could never have at one point in her life. Her grandfather, always loving and caring, did everything to make the day splendid for her. She couldn't have wished for anything more. And, of course, there was Emerald, their beautiful daughter. Sophia's heart filled with love as she thought about her little girl. As she pushed the stroller, Sophia felt grateful for the life she had built. She thought about how Charles supported her, encouraged her, and loved her for who she was. She thought about how Emerald brought joy and laughter every day. Sophia's heart was full as she walked, the stroller gliding smoothly along the sidewalk. She felt like the luckiest person in the world, and she knew she would never take this life, this love for granted. As she turned the corner, she spotted someone who looked familiar. At first, she thought it was just her eyes, but as she got closer, she knew she wasn't seeing things. "Helen!" The woman turned, holding the hands of children, one in each hand. When she saw it was Sophia, she gasped, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. "Sophia, how are you?" Sophia smiled when she saw her mother-in-law. She seemed to have lost all the shine she had years ago. Her once smooth skin was now filled with wrinkles. "I'm fine. Who are these beauties with you?" She gestured to the children Helen was holding. "Hi, darlings, how are you?" The children, who were busy looking at the nearby park, didn't notice Sophia's greeting. "I'm sorry, Sophia," Helen suddenly apologized. "It's okay, Helen. I don't hold anything against you. I'm sorry for everything that happened to you." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "I was so blind, Sophia. I thought money and status were everything, but I've learned my lesson. Being kind to people is what truly matters. I'm glad you've learned that, and I want to offer you something. The company is yours if you want it." Helen shook her head. "No, Sophia, I don't want it. I've realized that money isn't everything. I'm just happy to have experienced the change. I know it's late, but this is my daughter, Emerald Peterson. Charles and I got married and had a beautiful daughter." Sophia removed the cloth covering Emerald's body and gestured for Helen to see. "Emerald," Helen repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. Sophia nodded, smiling. "So we can remember you." Helen felt a wave of emotion as she looked at Emerald. No one had ever given their child's name in her honor before. She had always been the one who hurt people, caused pain and suffering. But now this little girl, this beautiful, innocent child, carried her name. Tears welled up in Helen's eyes as she looked at Emerald. She felt a sense of pride and joy she had never felt before. She reached out a trembling hand and gently touched Emerald's cheek. "Oh, my dear," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so honored. I don't deserve it, but I'm so grateful." Sophia smiled and hugged Helen tightly. "You deserve it, Helen. You deserve all the love and joy in the world." As Helen held Emerald in her arms, she felt a sense of redemption. She knew she had been given a second chance, a chance to be a good grandmother to this little girl, to be a good person. "We want to go to the park. We want to go to the park," the children she was holding said in unison. Helen smiled and nodded. "Not today, kids, but I promise we'll have fun anyway." Sophia looked at her curiously. "Are these little ones from the orphanage where I volunteer? I'm helping take care of them today. They don't have families, so I like to spend time with them and make them feel loved." "Oh, Helen, that's amazing. I had no idea you were involved with an orphanage. How did you start with that?" "I realized I had been given a second chance, and I wanted to use it to make a difference in others' lives. These children deserve love and care, and I'm happy to be able to provide that for them. You know, I've been thinking, despite our past differences, I'd like to extend an olive branch. Would you like to come to our house for dinner sometime?" Helen was surprised by the invitation. She didn't expect Sophia to reach out to her, especially after everything that had happened. "I don't know, Sophia," Helen said, hesitant. "I'm not sure it's a good idea." Sophia nodded. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I think it's time to let go of the past. We're family, after all, and I'd like to get to know you better. And I'm sure it's time for you and Charles to reconcile." Helen was touched by Sophia's words. She never expected her daughter-in-law to reach out, especially when she was the one who treated her poorly. "Okay," she nodded. "I'll come for dinner, but just me, not the orphanage kids." Sophia smiled. "Of course, just you. I'll make sure they cook something special." Helen was standing outside Sophia's house, taking a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. She hadn't seen her son, Charles, in years and didn't know what to expect. The door opened, and Sophia smiled warmly. "And come in." Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Charles. He looked older, more mature, but his eyes still had a hint of the pain she had caused. "Charles," she called, not moving from where she stood. "Mother." Helen took a step forward, her hands outstretched. "Charles, I don't know where to begin. I'm sorry for everything I did. I was wrong to treat you the way I did." Charles looked at her with suspicion, but Sophia stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "Charles, please listen to her." He nodded, and Helen continued. "I know I can never undo the pain I caused, but I want you to know that I love you. I've always loved you, and I'm proud of the man you've become." He looked at her, his eyes searching for sincerity. She had done many things that hurt him, things that took time to overcome. But now she was here. So slowly he nodded. "I love you too, Mother." Helen felt a lump form in her throat as Charles opened his arms, and she stepped into them, holding him tightly. The world seemed to stop at that moment, as if they were the only ones there. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She didn't bother to wipe the tears away. Charles reassured her, his own eyes wet with tears. "I forgive you, Mother. I forgive you." As they embraced, Sophia smiled, feeling at peace. This was what she had wanted for so long, for Charles and Helen to reconcile. After a few moments, Charles pulled away, smiling. "Let's sit down. We have a lot to talk about." Helen nodded, smiling, and the three of them sat in the living room, talking and laughing together, as it should be. As the evening wore on, Helen felt a sense of joy she hadn't felt in years. She had her son back, and she was grateful for it. Charles held his wife's hand, and they shared a look. Of all the things he had been blessed with in life, she was the most amazing of all. "Thank you," he said, with his lips making her smile like a schoolgirl who had just fallen in love. "So, did you like the story? We appreciate your company. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you thought of the story. See you next time.